Good morning and welcome to the daily Lighthouse meditation. I'm continuing the theme of the church under lockdown, or churches under lockdown, and I'm going to deal with a question that has been raised by a few people with me. Is freedom being lost as a result of this lockdown? Are we complying too much with the authorities? Are we allowing them to boss us in an unhealthy way? Now, a lot of people are complaining, aren't they? They're complaining about this lockdown. And some are complaining for economic reasons, and I'm going to deal with that very briefly, because I think that's an unfortunate coincidence. The economic depression has been coming for a long time, in my view. And I think it's going to be long and painful. I think more than most people, I'm expecting for the next few years for economic trouble to be of the order of it was in the early 1930s. If I'm wrong, I'd be happy about that. But I don't think it's just the lockdown that's going to cause it. I think we've been riding for a fall economically for a very long time. If you think about it, there must be something dangerously fragile about a world where a couple of months of a 30% drop in money circulation could really cause a disaster. Because that's what we're talking about here. We're probably talking about a 30% drop in monthly GDP for a few months. Now, if the world is that fragile, it has a problem anyway, in my view. And the reason it's fragile is because of the way we have been managed economically. The Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, all the central banks around the world have been looking after the financial parasites that live off our economy. The bankers and the super wealthy have been feather-bedded. They've been allowed to pay virtually no tax. They have been looked after whenever there was an economic crash or crisis. Now, in the Bible, God commanded the Jews to basically shut their economy down for a year every 7 years. The Sabbath year. In an agricultural economy, not to work the land for a whole year would sound like a huge economic hit, wouldn't it? In fact, it seems the Jews never really obeyed that properly because, of course, like most people, they're over-impressed by their ability to manage the economy and under-impressed by God's ability to look after them. It was the opposite of a fragile economy that God intended for them. It was also meant to be a low-tax, virtually unmilitarized economy as well. There were reasons why it was possible for the law of Moses to contain such rules. I'm going to leave economics for today. I'll probably talk about them more another time. Because there's a more serious complaint coming from Christian people, and that is about the loss of freedom that comes along with the lockdown. And Christians have an interest in being free. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Freedom of movement has obviously taken a hit. Again, there is a kind of irony here in that freedom of movement was one of the key sticking points over the Brexit discussions. But now, there is no freedom of movement in most EU countries as a result of the lockdown. More crucially, perhaps, freedom of association. This is a human right based on the idea that you have the right to meet up with other people and act with other people, whether that's political or religious or whatever. Freedom of association. Well, we're definitely being told we mustn't associate, certainly not physically. And closely related to that, of course, is freedom of religion. And already, freedom of religion has clashed with the lockdown in a number of places. The Catholic clergy are really chafing in Italy and Spain over the fact that they can't have their normal religious activities. You remember that in Iran People insisted on making their pilgrimage to their holy shrines, and that made the epidemic much worse. There was a Pentecostal conference in France in a place called Mulhouse in the eastern part of France. And the Pentecostal pastor couldn't see why he should agree with the government who asked him not to have his conference. So it went ahead. 2,500 people from all over France and other European countries gathered there. And unfortunately, it was just as the virus was really making its way in France. So the pastor got seriously ill. About 20 of his congregation got ill, and many people who went to that conference went and took the virus back to wherever they came from. And they've had quite a lot of hate mail as a result of the fact that they chose to exercise their religious freedom at just the wrong time. And of course there's economic freedom, isn't there? A lot of people claim that our other social freedoms depend on economic freedom, free enterprise, and that is certainly taking a hit from the rules about isolation and lockdown. But I want to go back to the religious aspect of this, because I think that's probably the one that I should be dealing with. Many people are saying that Christian freedom, or if not Christian, religious freedom, is under threat because of all of these new rules. And it is true that in our little way at the lighthouse, our freedom has been constricted. I mentioned the French pastor with his conference in Mulhouse. I've mentioned the Iranians with their religious sites. A friend told me just yesterday that Muslim politicians in the north of Nigeria want to break the lockdown rules in the states they govern because it's interfering with the celebration of Ramadan. And there was a charismatic fellowship in Korea who insisted on meeting against the wishes of the government, and that one fellowship became an epicenter for infection in South Korea. Eventually the pastor went on TV on his knees apologizing to the nation, which I think was a brave or necessary gesture. In America, anti-government fundamentalists are behind this anti-lockdown movement. American fundamentalism believes that any moment now the Antichrist is going to make his appearance, the beast of Revelation. They believe that he's going to use something like the lockdown to cement his power over the compliant masses. We had that manic, nutty obsession about 5G, didn't we, a couple of months ago, when Christians were busy promulgating this idea that 5G radiation was causing the coronavirus and it was all part of the mark of the beast. Again, religious resistance to the lockdown. Well, what do we make of this? I don't think that a Christian should do what the powers that be tell them to do automatically. According to Romans 13, obedience should be our first reaction, our normal reaction, even to bad government. But there are times when Christians should be unreasonably stubborn when it comes to being told to do something that we know is wrong. Then we become very awkward, even in the face of powerful government figures. But I think in the case of this lockdown, I don't think we're being told to do anything sinful. And I would argue that it's a primary act of Christian love here to comply with the lockdown. We know very well that you can carry the virus to other people without even knowing that you're infected. So if you're going to love your neighbour, you really shouldn't infect them unnecessarily. And I've already mentioned what happens when religious people refuse to comply and become mass carriers of the virus. Now some people say, but with regard to the economy, loving your neighbour means we shouldn't agree to have the economy wrecked. But I've been trying to make the point already that I think the economy was fragile anyway, and if it wasn't for the virus, something else would have come along. Boom and bust are normal in a capitalist society. And if we really cared about this unjust and disaster-prone system, why weren't we making a fuss beforehand? Because sooner or later, the next bust was going to have terrible effects on the poorest people. No, I think there's a lot of self-interest going on here, really. Now, over the next few days, I'm going to be considering the roots of Christian freedom. And I don't really have time to deal with it properly in one little meditation. But I want to say basically that I do not believe Christian freedom is under attack. I do not believe there is a secret conspiracy. I strongly suspect that Christian faith will be as strong or stronger at the end of this little crisis than it was at the beginning. Because our freedom is not based on what the government gives us in the way of freedom. Our freedom comes from another place altogether. Christians have always been free, even when they were Roman slaves. What Jesus did for us on the cross has created a freedom which is largely separate from the intellectual modern ideas of freedom that you find in the American Declaration of Independence or the constitutions of European countries. Our freedom comes from the fact that Jesus subjected himself to the powers that be and basically defeated them at the cross and in his resurrection. But I realise I've spent my time for today, so for tomorrow we're going to look at the way Jesus makes us free, even under repressive regimes. But for now, I just want to say I believe it is my Christian duty and yours to comply with what the authorities are asking us to do with regard to this lockdown. Well, I hope that's helpful. Just a quick, brief look at the subject. But let's enjoy our freedom even while we're locked down. That's the gist of what I'm trying to say. Bye for now.